Hello everybody, welcome to the county seat. This week I'm your host Chad Booth, and if you notice, we're not in a studio setting today. We are out on location, and we have every elected official that actually deals with Southern Utah. And joining us for our conversation about issues specific to Southern Utah, we're pleased to have Senator Mitt Romney with us for this conversation. I would like to talk about a little bit of the conversations we've had so far today. And one area that seems to be on the mind of the local elected officials is their heavy reliance on PILT and the fact that it has been a begging, as Mark Whitney from Beaver County said, we have to go back and beg every single year for it.
Well, it is true. I hear now and then from senators from the East in particular, how come we're paying all this money out to these western states? Don't understand why we're doing that. It seems like charity. It's like, no, you have to understand. These counties are responsible for search and rescue, for fire, for policing, and this is federal land. In some cases, we got counties, 90% of the county is federal land. Someone's got to oversee that land, and they got to be paid to be able to have people do that. So in my view, the key thing we have to do with PILT, beyond thinking about what the formula is upon which different counties get reimbursed, but the key thing we have to do is to go away from this annual process of begging and trying to do trades to get the money that's necessary, and instead get permanent authorization for PILT. Now, we did that with regards to the Land and Water Conservation Bill. And so the ability to take care of our national parks, the ability to buy additional federal land, hopefully in the east, not in the west.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up.
Yeah. I mean, so there's permanent authorization for funding there. We need to do the same thing for PILT, get it permanently authorized.
And the way the formula is figured, it's like Washington County gets quite a bit of money, but they have a pretty good population. Piute County, which has only a couple of thousand people in the whole county, they get practically nothing, but they still have the same problems. And when you take that low density population with lots of acres like Wayne or Garfield County, they have a real challenge on PILT and SRS.
Yeah, I think there's a very valid claim to be made that we got to look at the formula. I know that the reality is that if somebody's getting more and the pot doesn't grow, why, that means somebody's getting less. And that means you're going to have people fighting with each other, and it's very hard to change the formula. But where particularly you have tourism, where a lot of people coming into a county and you need a lot of more search and rescue capacity, not compensating for that doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think there is an argument to be made that we can do a better job in adjusting the formula, particularly for those counties with low population, a large amount of land, and where there's a good deal of tourism, and therefore more demand for public service.
And this was something that in all the discussions we've had over the last decade about this, I never heard until today is the concept of saying, okay, take your transient population and count that as part of your formula.
Well, at least get some credit for the tourism and for the search and rescue required, and by the way, fire and police required by virtue of that additional population coming into a county. If we can get that principle understood, then I think over time we can adjust in a way that people won't object to in too aggressive a way.
Any real surprises today in the conversation so far that have come from local leaders that you went, I hadn't thought about that?
Well, I was interested in their perspective on several pieces of legislation. There's 6 pieces of legislation that relate to PILT that are already filed in Washington. And we're getting some feedback from one commissioner after the other as to what they think about each one of them. And I can push with others in our delegation for ones that we think will make a difference. One, for instance, was to say, look, any county that has 5,000 population or lower gets the same number. Well, there's a piece of legislation that says, no, it should be 5,000, 4,000, 3, 2, 1, depending on what your population is. That's the sort of thing we want to hear. Is that something we support and I should get behind? Or something the commissioners say, no, don't do that, and we can oppose. So we need to get our marching orders because, by the way, the commissioners on the ground, they're our bosses. They report to the people, and then they bring that along to us, and my job is to make sure that we're doing what's needed for the people and the commissioners.
If we were talking about policy side and legislation that might help policy, do you think that as a reasonable compromise, we might actually be able to get some legislation passed that gives local governments a little bit, some real teeth in setting policy on the public lands?
Let me tell you, that's, I think, has to be our highest priority. For me, the key thing is more local involvement, more local input in how lands are managed. And in some cases, let's say it's a national forest, just saying, you know what, the Forest Service, we're going to offload to the state the responsibility for managing, perhaps just on a trial basis, this part of the national forest. And the state's going to do a better job. We care more at about the preservation of the forest because we live here. And we want to make sure that these forests are being managed properly. That's true throughout every aspect of federal lands. The state's going to do a better job.
Do you think the Senate and the House actually will have the cojones to actually take a little bit of the regulatory freedom away from the executive agencies and say, you will do this, and engage and lay those parameters? Because given a chance to find a way around it, my experience has been they'll try and find a way around it.
Yeah, the regulators love regulation. The bureaucrats love being in a bureaucracy, and trying to get them out of the way and have decisions made on a state basis is something they oppose. But let me tell you, I've had the chance of working in a state. You know, I was governor of another state. We got stuff done. States were able to do things. The federal government just can't get stuff done. So getting everything away from the federal government that you can and down to the states and localities is a far better way to go. The feds will object, they'll push back hard, but it does take leadership. And you know, members of the delegation, we're kind of small leaders. Members of the administration, they have a lot more say. And getting them to speak out on this, getting the president to speak out on this and to crack the whip would make a real difference.
All right. Senator, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us. And I know I put you behind schedule on a hike, so I'm going to let you catch up. And we will continue to catch up on the county seat. We will be right back in a minute. We'll continue our conversation with the congressional delegation that's along on this tour today. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the county seat. We're having a conversation with the congressional delegation who is out on the ground today in southern Utah in the 2nd Congressional District. Joining us right now for a conversation is Congressman Chris Stewart. We are in his district right now, and we're talking about issues that are very important to the 2nd District. Congressman, thank you for coming on the tour and coming out here.
Oh, Chad, great to be with you, and you're right, this is my district. I love this district. Oh my gosh, it's the most beautiful place on earth.
Have you ever been up here before?
I have been, actually, yes, but it's been quite a while.
Wow.
Yeah, we try to get around a little bit, so, and like I said, it's so beautiful.
The issues today that we're talking about have been really centered around the forest and natural resources, and that seems to be the biggest problem for the 2nd District in its rural part.
Yeah.
How are you working at addressing those issues for the counties, and what have you learned today from these commissioners?
Some of the counties that I represent have 97% of the county that's federal lands or a little bit of state lands. I mean, they have no tax base. You can't generate revenue for your sheriffs, for law enforcement, for schools, for roads. And so one of the things we've been talking about is SRS, Secure Rural Schools, or the PILT program, Payment in Lieu of Taxes, which is the federal government's rather miserly efforts to say, well, we've taken all your land, but here's a few dollars and that'll help offset it. Well, it's pennies on the dollar, and we have to fight for it every year. Every year it's the same battle. Let's go fight to try and get a little bit of our PILT payments. So that's one of the things that we've been talking about, and how we can put that on a more sustainable path. Right here in this spot, we're talking about forestry. And you know, when I was young, Chad, when you were young, there was a fairly healthy forest industry here in Utah, and it's all disappeared. And they say, well, it's because we don't have marketable forests, it's small circuit diameter wood. That's not true. There's a market for this. And to look around and see this dead wood and think it's just going to waste, or the federal government's going to pay someone to come pile it up and burn it. We can surely do better than that.
Let's just tackle PILT first.
Yeah.
How do you overcome the thresholds of PILT? I mean, obviously permanent funding is one, but obviously from the conversation today, that's not all of it.
Yeah, and it's a big key, and sitting on the Appropriations Committee is kind of the key for that, and that's make sure we get that funding every year. But we also want to recognize, and a lot of it is educating my friends in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, because if you're a Republican from South Carolina, you have no idea what this is.
Today I heard a lot of talk about staging PILT. In other words, it's kind of a one-size-fits-all, relatively so, and it's a simple formula of you got 200,000 people, you got so much money, you got so many acres of federal land, and there's a formula.
Yeah.
But when you get to the smaller counties with few people in them, they're the ones that need the money, and they don't even get much of those pennies.
And the other thing is they're operating on such a margin. If you're a larger county, you generally have a little bit of a larger buffer. Smaller counties, small population base, they have no margin at all. And so you have a 10% reduction in them. It's an enormous challenge for them. And I think one of the solutions to that would be allow the state to divide up the PILT payments. Allow the state to decide which counties need it more. And I know we'd come to a better solution if we did that, rather than have it be a formula in Washington, D.C. that's supposed to apply to every county throughout the country.
Well, let's talk about the problems that have come up with logging and forestry. How do we get this wood off here? Because nobody wants to be engaged in the small diameter timber business in Utah. What are the solutions?
The industry will tell you, if you can give us some reliability, some predictability, so that we know if we go into and we make a bid on a stand that we're not going to get kicked off, or that it's going to be, we can be there long enough to make our money back, then we'll make that investment in the forest industry back in Utah again. The key to this, Chad, really is one thing: give them predictability. Give them the assurance that it's not going to be for 1 year at a time and then maybe it all disappears underneath them.
So like this shared stewardship concept that's been floating around for a couple of years really makes some sense, where you involve a local community in it and say, okay, this is the area and this is what we want to see in 20 years. Do you think that goes a long way to solving the problem?
It's huge, and I'm not saying that in a patronizing way. I'm telling you it's huge. Because what we're relying on right now is some bureaucrat sitting in Washington, D.C., who, by the way, has never been to Utah and has no intention of visiting Utah, and yet he's making decisions based on our local community, on our backyard. And we're just simply saying, let the state have some involvement. Let county commissioners have some involvement in that.
We'll continue our conversation with the delegation here on location in southern Utah when we come back on the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. We are in the 2nd Congressional District on a tour with our congressional delegation, finding out about the issues of rural Utah today. Joining us is, for this segment of the show, is someone we very seldom get a chance to talk to, and it's been far too long, Senator Mike Lee. Senator, it's good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
We've been talking about a lot of issues today, and one of the points that's come up in the conversation is about streamlining NEPA. And NEPA's been a big problem. I mean, it's been a problem for people trying to put in power lines. It's even been a problem for Boy Scout troops that want to have more than 12 people on a camp out. How do we fix it?
The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA as we describe it, was passed with the best of intentions, and it's done a lot of good. It requires the government to take certain steps before taking certain action that might impact the environment. It's been a good thing on the whole. But from time to time, like any law, it needs to be updated and reevaluated, and in this case, revised. Sometimes the NEPA process takes not only years, but in some cases, decades. That's wrong. It ends up adversely affecting poor and middle-class Americans, especially poor and middle-class Utahns, particularly those in rural areas.
As I read through the recommendations from your office, one of the things that stood out to me is allowing, and this is going to be the hard question, allowing qualified third parties to perform work on the NEPA process. That could be good or it could be bad. It depends upon who that qualified party is which one's selected. I mean, SUA would not be very good to do that.
It wouldn't. You're right. The overall thinking, though, behind the Unshackle Act, which is the legislation I've introduced in order to reform NEPA, is that getting work done is better than the work not getting done. If it has to be done, we'd rather have more available resources that we can put on the project so that a government decision can be made. So they can decide whether or to what extent a particular project might be threatening to the environment, such that other alternatives need to be considered. That process right now gets stalled in bureaucratic red tape, sometimes for decades at a time. That's bad.
So part of this also is tied into one of the other provisions in that summary that I was looking at, talked about state's NEPA work or NEPA-like work done in the state should be able to just be accepted by the federal government as credentialed work in this process. What connection do you see between that and the Utah state law about preparing long-range planning for local counties?
This actually ties in well, and this ties in with other environmental laws that in some instances allow states like ours to perform certain work that would otherwise have to be performed by the federal government. In the case of Utah, we're good stewards of the earth here. We look after the earth. We're all about habitat conservation. We're all about making sure that our environment is clean and that it's fit for future generations, and that we leave it, if anything, better than we found it. And because we're good at it, much better than the feds, some of that work can be done right here at the local level, performed by Utah state government officials rather than feds.
Part of your bill talks about setting some very specific deadlines that things have to happen in. Has there been a tendency for the federal government to want to kick something down the road because they don't want to issue NEPA policy and just kind of ignore it?
Sure. There are a few ways in which this happens. One way in which the delay can occur under NEPA is that people, being humans, get busy with other projects, or maybe they don't want to have to worry about two projects at once, so they might sideline one while they finish the other. And as these things happen, that can end up going on for a really, really long time. But another thing that can happen is sometimes people within government, or at least people close to government who have influence within it, might dislike a particular project. And they might realize that they can't defeat it on its merits, that they're not going to win at the end of the day. But if they can delay it long enough, maybe
it'll go away.
The people who want the project will just go away. And sometimes that happens.
So there's some interesting elements of what you're talking about is if they don't perform, take some of their budget away.
Yeah, it's really the only way Washington responds, because government isn't responsive to the same metrics, to the same forces as a business. And so one thing that they do understand is having their budget cut. If they don't live up to certain standards, these aren't overly onerous requirements. They're just saying there do need to be limits. It's one of the many reasons why basketball is a much more exciting sport to watch since the advent of the shot clock. We want to bring the shot clock to NEPA.
Thank you so much for taking time to join us. We will come back with the county seat and continue our conversation on this tour of southern Utah on rural issues. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the county seat. For our fourth conversation, we're going to the 4th Congressional District. We're having an opportunity to talk to Representative Ben Mcadams, who used to be the mayor of Salt Lake County. Ben, thank you so much for taking time. How are you feeling?
I'm actually feeling really good. I had a really rough bout with COVID, spent 8 days in the hospital, but I'm doing a lot better right now.
We followed it in the paper. So
yeah, thank you.
That's
well, it's great to be back on the county seat, too. I miss county government.
Well, that's, I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But, so, you know, Senator Romney was talking a little bit earlier in the show, and he said, yeah, we got a lot of great ideas, but, you know, there's always going to be somebody else that has another interest. Is there a way we're ever going to get past some of these public land, southern Utah issues, and ever going to be able to cross party lines? Because it just seems...
You know, I think so. I think, you know, in a democracy, real success comes from mathematics of multiplication, not division. And so what I'm hearing as we've been talking amongst ourselves today as a delegation, talking with our county commissioners and people from across the state of Utah, is really giving me some ideas about where that mathematics of multiplication might happen. How do we broaden the tent? Rather than narrow it and talk about issues that divide us and us versus them, how do we broaden the tent? And there's some real issues that Utah faces that people have to understand that you know, and maybe have a shared interest. Utah, you know, having some reliability of our PILT funds and making sure that you're not budgeting not knowing if a couple months from now you're going to have a government shutdown or they're going to slash the budget, and you're hiring law enforcement and search and rescue and other people for Utah's beautiful public lands, and you just don't even know if the budget's going to be there at the end of the day. That is something that I can take back to my colleagues in Washington and tell them how important it is and how much the federal government has really been such a a faithless partner and someone who we can't rely on, and we've got to change that.
So what was the real eye-opener so far? I mean, we've had like 2 or 3 stops today, and we've been talking about other issues. Was there an aha moment for you where you said, oh my gosh, this really is more of a problem than we thought?
As we were talking today, and they were talking about how difficult it is to budget, not knowing if next month the federal government is going to be there with the commitment that they've made, that is, I can relate to that. Now, Salt Lake County didn't have PILT, didn't rely on those same revenues, but I can totally relate with needing the predictability. If you're going to be fiscally responsible, you need to have revenues that are somewhat predictable. And so, that's an area where I think I can go back to my colleagues, Republican and Democrat, help them see that the way we've done things in the past is unacceptable, and we've got to do better.
How are you going to overcome the constituencies? And this becomes an issue I think about a lot. The parties are made up of such coalitions and such constituencies. The ranchers are pretty much in the Republicans' camp. The environmentalists are pretty much in the Democrats' camp now. How do you get past these dogmas that they all have?
You got to start by looking at what we have in common. Now, if an environmentalist thinks that a rancher doesn't love the land, they're sorely mistaken. Ranchers who have spent generations earning a living off of the land, they love the land. Now, they may have different positions or attitudes or philosophies about how land should be managed and how to approach it, but for me, I always look for the kernel of common ground and then build on that. And I think there is a lot of common ground between those who use our lands to recreate, to camp and to hike and mountain bike, and those who use our lands to ranch and provide the food that many of us eat. There's a common ground that, Utah is a unique place. We love this place, and we want to protect what's special about it. And let's start with that.
If there's one thing you were going to take back to Washington and try and take that kernel of commonality and turn it into a momentum and possibly even try and help find some co-sponsors for a bill, what would it be?
I think we've got to get past dividing ourselves into camps, environmentalists and ranchers, or Republicans or Democrats, and it's looking at what we have in common. And again, success is going to be based on mathematics of multiplication, not division. I think mathematics of division finds us frustrated and angry and in camps of us versus them. And look at it and say, how do we multiply and find the common ground that we can move forward and execute on some solutions. And it may not be 100% of what one side wants or 100% of the other side wants, but division and controversy results in gridlock and everybody loses.
Okay, well, what's the one thing constituents can do to help the congressional delegation, regardless of the party, move things along back there?
I think expect people to have a nuanced conversation, to reject the politics of me versus you, us versus them, and let's expect our elected officials to sit down and talk and find common ground and pragmatic solutions that can actually put some of these challenges we've faced for decades, find a resolution that can move us forward.
Remember, you are actually part of that solution. As everybody has said today, without the constituents, without you being engaged, we can't get there. So get read on these issues, study up, get ready, be prepared, and remember that local government is the place where your life happens, so be more than an observer, be involved, and we'll see you next week on the County Seat. Thank you for watching the County Seat. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications to keep up to date on the program and happenings around Utah.